Hello, good people. It is great to be back with you. I'm going to call this particular video the flailing of the American mind, because there is some particular phenomena I keep seeing when I'm watching conversations with people or conversations between people about the state of our economy and how we got to where we are. And the conversation goes like this. Somebody will start talking about all the problems that there are in our economy, the injustices, the inequality of the way that wealth is distributed, the way that so much wealth and opportunity is flowing to very few at the very top, and they realize that something is wrong with this, but they're afraid to say, well, this is the result of capitalism. Because if they say that, it's like mentally there's this loop in their mind that I talked about in my last video, where they start thinking that if they criticize capitalism, then they're saying that we should be socialist or communist, and they realize that that's not the right path, and so they don't know what to do about this issue. Now, I'm going to liken this to traveling down a road. Talked before about Hilaire Belloc's great book, The Servile State, where he discusses the economy of Rome and then the fall of the Roman Empire and how the economy of Europe was restructured by the Catholic Church under the tutelage of the Catholic Church to a distributed economy. That is an economy where most of the people were owners of their own productive property. They did not work for other people, but they were owners of their own property, and therefore they were free. Now, Hilaire Belloc also explained about how the Protestant Reformation changed that, and then the Industrial Revolution took the people who had been made proletariat, that is, not being owners of property, took them and put them to work in industry. And now, just to satisfy some of my people who are paying a lot of attention to the way I phrase things, I'll say, okay, they didn't take them and put them to work in industry. The people went to work in industry because they didn't have any choice, otherwise they would starve. And so that's how we ended up with the situation that we had at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Now, people realize that that's what happened in history. And they realize that there is a kind of fork in the road that the country came to. This country came to it. A lot of countries in Europe came to it. The fork in the road is whether you're going to have a free market capitalist economy or whether you're going to have a socialist economy. And then a decision has to be made when you come to that fork in the road. Here's the problem that Hilaire Belloc pointed out. He said, when you come to the fork in the road and you make the decision, the free market capitalist economy, what you don't realize is that the socialist road keeps going over this direction, but the free market capitalist economy kind of circles around, and at some point it's going to meet that socialist road. That's what we see happening in our country. And it seems like as we get closer and closer to that socialist path that we all want to avoid, people don't know what to do other than to press harder on the pedal and go faster on the road that we're on, and keep saying, well, you know, we've got to have capitalism, free market capitalism, because otherwise we're headed towards socialism. And all the while they're saying that, they're actually going closer to socialism. So we are headed faster and faster toward that which we want to avoid. And of course, if you think there's only the two forks in the road to take, then you don't realize that, wait a minute, there's a third option. We could turn around from that point at which we made that decision, and we can go back the other way toward a distributed economy. This is particularly difficult for Americans to understand because of a peculiar history of our country. Okay, now I want to talk about that in light of a conversation that Joe Rogan had with Peter Schiff. Now, I don't know if you follow Joe Rogan or if you heard this conversation with Peter Schiff. It was really great. Peter Schiff is, he's an investment guy. He's an investment guru. He guides people in investments. He manages people's money. He's big on the idea of buying gold. He's kind of a, sky's falling kind of guy when it comes to the economy. Somebody in the comments under Joe Rogan's interview with him said, Peter Schiff has correctly predicted the last 5, Peter Schiff has correctly predicted 15 of our last 5 recessions. I thought that was kind of funny. But the thing that I like about listening to Peter Schiff is he is a big booster and proponent of a free market economy. And one of the things that he correctly brings out about a free market economy is that a free market economy is the most efficient at the distribution or the allocation of resources and labor within an economy. And he's right about that. And I think everybody should listen to the robust defense of a free market economy that he gave on the Joe Rogan show. Here's the problem, though. Peter Schiff is confused about a particular point. So when he's talking about what's going on in our economy, he blames our problems on government interference in the economy. And many of the things he says are correct and are echoed by a number of other people. However, when he was talking to Joe Rogan, Peter Schiff said that we just had to look back in history and we could see that before the government started doing all this interfering with the economy, that we were a very prosperous country. And he's talking about like the late 1800s to the early 1900s, all the building. He talks about the great country that was built by these free Americans, prosperous Americans. Okay. And then he says, and then the government started interfering in the economy and they messed everything up. They did things like put in all kinds of laws about labor and restrictions on this, that, and the other thing. And Peter Schiff doesn't like any of that stuff, minimum wage and whatever. He's against all of that government interference in the free market. Now, let's analyze what he's saying for just a minute. What he's saying is that the American people were so free and they were so prosperous at this time that they turned around and begged their government to interfere in their prosperous economy. Does that make even a lick of sense? Obviously, there's a problem here. What it is that there were 2 Americas at that time. There was a prosperous, free America, and of course, we can't say it was 100%. Like, I'll give you an example. So, at the time at the end of the Civil War, there was a promise made to freed African Americans, freed Black Americans, that they would have 40 acres and a mule, meaning that they could have their own productive property. Well, that promise was reneged upon shortly thereafter, and they did not get their promised productive property. But they wanted to be productive citizens owning their own productive property, as so many white Americans were. In spite of the handicaps of their former condition of slavery, many of them did come to own their own productive property. Many of them, they built towns, they had shops and all kinds of, all kinds of craftsmen. And that, unfortunately, what would happen is they would get a little town established or something, and then some of the, especially in the South, the Southerners who were trying to keep them down would come in and destroy everything that they built. But the Black population at the time of the elimination of slavery was extremely entrepreneurial and very interested in owning their own productive property. But anyway, throughout the country, that was the general rule. Most Americans owned their own productive property. Well, in the 1860s, they began laying a railroad across the United States, okay? And the railroad magnates, the railroad tycoons, could not find enough American citizens, free American citizens who owned their own productive property, to work for them at laying the railroad at the price that they wanted to pay. Now, I want you to be conscious of this. Whenever you hear some capitalists say, well, I can't get anybody to work to do this work, whatever the kind of work it is that he's talking about, whether it's, driving spikes into railroad ties or whether it's picking some crop or something, because I can't get any Americans to do it. I've got to have labor from somewhere else. What he means is, I just don't want to pay enough I don't want to pay a price that would induce Americans who own their own productive property are not a proletariat laboring class looking for work and desperate for work. I can't pay them enough to do this job so that I can make my millions of dollars that I want to make. So anyway, they were laying the railroad, and you had this population of Americans that mostly were not proletariat, that were not begging someone for a job, that were not willing to work for the pitiful wages that the railroad companies wanted to pay. And so the railroad companies got their labor from two other sources. So the railroad coming from the eastern part of the United States ended up being built mostly by Irish laborers who came over the Atlantic because of the desperate conditions that were in Ireland. And they became laborers on the railroad. And then on the western part of the railroad, coming from I think from Sacramento is where they started, that part of the railroad, they got Chinese laborers to labor. Again, people who came over to this country because of the desperate conditions in their country, and who then were proletariat and available for the labor to build the railroads. So then you had this entire industrial system coming up in the United States and making use of labor that was flowing into the United States from elsewhere, that was not, that people who did not have their own productive means, their own means of production, and so were proletariat and available to be exploited by the industrial class. Okay, so it was that group of people that made the complaint, and also the observation of other Americans about the way they were being treated. To give an example, the Chinese laborers were paid, I think it was like 30 or 50% of what the white laborers were paid. Their working conditions were horrible. Their living conditions were horrible. And at one point, I think it was in the late 1860s, they had a strike. And of course they had, they were in camps, tent camps, that were being moved along as they built the railroad. And it was pretty easy for the railroad to break the strike. They just stopped delivering food to the labor camp. And so the Chinese went ahead and finished building the railroad, although the railroad did ameliorate their conditions somewhat because they were afraid of losing their labor entirely. But you can see that you had to have, these industrialists had to have a proletariat class of people available to exploit not in order for them to get the railroad built, because if they would have been willing to pay enough, they could have gotten other Americans to build the railroad. But because they wanted to make their millions and millions of dollars in profit for themselves personally, they wanted to have available to them a proletariat class of people to exploit as labor. That is the lesson that we learn from history, and it was their exploitation of the proletariat class that led the people of the United States to beg the government for some kind of relief to these horrible conditions that these working people, these laboring people, were being put through. So Peter Schiff is looking at one aspect of the country, the part of the country that was not proletariat, and he's saying, look how creative and dynamic and prosperous they were, and look at everything they built. Yes, but you had another part of the country, a part of the country that was proletariat, and they were exploited and horribly treated by the industrialists, and that is what led to the people begging for socialist remedies, because capitalism will always lead to people begging for socialist remedies. And as Joe Rogan and Peter Schiff were talking, even though Peter Schiff hardly ever let Joe Rogan get a word in edgewise, Joe Rogan could see that something was wrong with what Peter Schiff was saying, and he kept talking about people who didn't have opportunity, people who didn't have a chance, people who were not given a fair shake, etc. And Peter Schiff was kind of blind to the desperation and the problems that, you know, it seems that a lot of people have. He doesn't probably deal that much with people with those kind of issues because, you know, he's managing the money of wealthy people who are buying gold all over the place. But Joe Rogan had the intuition that something was just a little bit wrong with this picture, that it was capitalism that was leading to these problems, which Peter Schiff kept saying, it's not capitalism, it's when the government interferes. And you see people flailing around trying to figure out, what do we call this thing we have now? Because it's not really capitalism, and they want to say, well, it's crony capitalism, it's corruption, it's corporatism, whatever, you know. Well, you know what it is? It's capitalism. That's what it is. It is the logic of capitalism, because it is the logic of capitalism to always exploit every resource the maximum can for profit, including the human resource of labor. And it is also the logic of capitalism to constantly annihilate its competition. That is part of the logic of capitalism. That's what the railroad tycoons did. Any, you know, small railroads around, they destroyed them. They put them out of business. They ate them up, you know, by buying them or whatever, because they wanted to have monopolistic control over that industry. So another person that I heard talking recently, about these economic issues was an interview with Ron Paul that David Gornosky did. Now, David Gornosky has been on Paul VanderKlay before, and I started following him after he appeared on Paul VanderKlay. He's an interesting guy. He has a radio show, and what he does is he makes a YouTube video out of his radio show. And I'll put a link to his YouTube channel in the description of this video. But he had an interesting conversation with Ron Paul. And again, they're talking about the same thing. They're talking about what's gone wrong with our economy. Now, Ron Paul sees the problem with the economy as starting when President Nixon took the dollar off of the gold standard. Ron Paul says that was what got him involved in politics, is his finding that to be quite outrageous. He made the interesting point that that George Floyd was arrested for counterfeiting, and Ron Paul says the real counterfeiters is the federal bank. It's printing counterfeit money all of the time. I thought that was kind of an interesting observation. So Ron Paul talking about the economy and talking about the necessity of a free market and how we don't have one because of government interference in the market now. And you know, David Gornosky is asking him similar questions to the way that Joe Rogan was talking to Peter Schiff, as they're trying to navigate this idea of, well, what kind of market do we want? What kind of market are we supposed to have? What's gone wrong with our system, etc. And so Ron Paul has a lot of good ideas. He's very libertarian. I guess you probably know that about him. And he has a lot of good ideas about how the economy ought to be versus how it is being run now. But at one point in their conversation, Ron Paul makes a comment in response to a question with David Gornosky. You know, David Gornosky is asking about like tariffs and, you know, putting restrictions on goods from other places, etc. Well, Ron Paul doesn't like that, because he says this. He says, well, the consumer should have, you know, they should have it available to them to buy products wherever they can find the best price, whether that's in their, you know, local area or their own country or state or something, or whether it's overseas. There shouldn't be any restrictions on that or anything that artificially bumps up the price of that product from overseas, so that because that affects the consumer. Okay. There's a problem with that, because the logic of that also would apply to labor. Because if you're going to view labor as one of the costs of production of a product, which under distributism you wouldn't view labor that way, but in capitalism that's how you view labor. View labor as a cost, well then the businessman who is going in search of a product to buy, and the product he wants to buy in this case, or the commodity he wants to buy in this case, is labor. Why should he not go to another country to find cheaper labor? It's exactly the logic of capitalism that has got us into this problem. And here's another point. The point of capitalism is always to seek to socialize costs and privatize profits, okay? There is a socialized cost when someone buys something farther away from where they are. The cost is in the fact that they make their own society, whether it's their own city, their own state, their own country, they make it weaker. They restrict or limit the capacity of their own country to make things. They cause their country to be more dependent. They cause their fellow citizens to be more in need of assistance, to be less independent and less able to provide things for their neighbors. And so it seems like that would be a rational thing to do. Well, let me find the best price on something, and if it's from far away, well, that's okay, I'll get it there because I'll save a few dollars. But my local community is being hollowed out, is being less independent, it's less strong, it has less of a base, an economic base itself. And so there's a cost to that, getting something from far away. But the cost is not borne directly within the price of the product. In other words, when we do that, when we get things from far away, and we see that now with this whole coronavirus and with the fact that we don't make our own medicines and all of the stuff that's just come to light about the way that our economy is running, we see that there was all along for the past 40 years of this globalization, there have been hidden costs that we couldn't see, but they were still there. Those costs were still there, and those costs were socialized. They've come down upon our entire country, and the profits, where are the profits? They're in the pockets of the rich capitalists who could take their, who could buy their labor overseas or buy their components of their products, etc., overseas. They have made our country weak, and they have made our people more dependent and more proletariat. Now, I think that people who are generally conservative, and we would say are on the right, are starting to wake up to the fact that somehow or another we have been played, we have been damaged. Our country that appeared so strong and robust at the end of the 20th century has now, as we enter into the 21st century, into the middle of the 21st century, is appearing weak, it's appearing fragmented, it's appearing to be economically on the verge of devastation. And people who are conservative and on the right are beginning to recognize that, and they're beginning to talk amongst themselves and say, this has something to do with capitalism, but we don't want socialism and we don't want communism. What do we do? So one good example of that is a guy that I follow named Josh. I think his last name might be Scanlon or something like that. But anyway, he's a guy who's over here in my area, not too far away. He's in the greater Atlanta area. And he has a YouTube channel called Heritage Wealth Planning. He's actually written a book or two about retirement planning. And I like to listen to him. He walks along the street with his little dog named Pablo, and takes him for a walk, and as he's walking he makes videos and just chats about this, that, and the other thing. A lot of times he chats about planning for retirement, or just whatever comes to his mind. It might be a topic of religion, might be some book he's recently reading, might be something in the news, whatever. He chats about different topics, and he's quite a pleasant fellow to listen to. So anyway, he was talking about the fact that he is a conservative, and he used to be very liberal. He's become more conservative. And he says that he does not understand why it is that conservatives, people on the right, or Republicans, don't recognize what a legitimate problem and issue the wealth disparity in the country is. So, I'll put a link to the video where he talks about that. That's not the main topic of his video, but kind of like in the middle of his video, he starts saying this. I'm listening to him and going, yes, you're seeing it. That is a real problem. Of course, someone who's really been kind of hammering on this issue has been Brett Weinstein in his conversations with Heather Heying, his wife, and also recently he did a conversation, another conversation with a Black man from England, and his name escapes me at the moment, but they had a great conversation, and Brett Weinstein talked about that again. He talked about the fact that it is natural, this is kind of how he put it, I'm just paraphrasing, not exactly quoting him, but that it's natural for people, once they get into a position of power, where they have a lot of economic power, and they have the opportunity to hoard wealth to themselves, that they will do it. And that is what is happening. He talks about the hoarding of wealth, the hoarding of well-being, the restriction of the opportunities of other people, etc. And he has been really talking about that quite a lot. And his point is true. It is the real big problem in our society right now. As Brett Weinstein and other people have observed, that is the real issue that people should be in the street about. Bishop Fulton Sheen said that a nation of dependent citizens was not the kind of nation that we set out to be. We set out to be a nation of independent citizens, and for a while, we were independent citizens. What lost us our independence, or what lost us our independence was capitalism. Capitalism, the swallowing up constantly of smaller enterprises and of household enterprises by larger and larger corporations, and then those larger corporations using their economic power to gain political power, so that we more and more have a citizenry that is dependent on going to the capitalists and asking for work, or asking to be allowed to work for them at whatever particular conditions they decide to allow you to work at, because the bargaining power of the worker has gone right down the drain. Unions have been destroyed over the past 30, 40 years, and you no longer have the bargaining power that a laborer used to have, and so people are forced to accept worse and worse working conditions, and they are. Now, the working conditions are not so physically horrible as they used to be, because most of the manufacturing was taken away from the country. But as manufacturing comes back in the country, and it's going to have to come back because we got to have stuff, and we're going to have to make it ourselves. We can't get it from elsewhere for the most part. We're going to have to make a lot more stuff ourselves. What you can expect is that with the destruction of the small businesses that has gone on since this virus has, we've been dealing with this virus, that more and more Americans are falling into the class of being proletariat, not owners of their own productive property, and therefore at the mercy of the capitalists who will exploit their labor. This is a terrible situation. We do not want to be a proletariat country, and we should not be. So we're going to have to figure some way to get ourselves out of a proletariat position. Otherwise, we're going to be exploited horribly, because that's what capitalism does. Sorry, that is what capitalism does. And what would be even worse would be for this situation to land us in the situation of being communist or socialist country, because then our freedoms are going to be even more curtailed, and we will be even more oppressed. So this is not a good situation. The thing to do is to go back to that fork in the road that our country had all those years ago, when we chose between capitalism and socialism, and we chose capitalism. Let's go back to that fork in the road, and instead of making the decision again between those two, turn around and go back the way we came, go back to being a free citizenry with most of the people owning their own productive property. At the very end of his magisterial treatment of the moral condition of our modern society, called After Virtue, Alasdair MacIntyre had this to say: "A crucial turning point in that earlier history occurred when men and women of goodwill turned aside from the task of shoring up the Roman Imperium and ceased to identify the continuation of civility and moral community with the maintenance of that imperium. What they set themselves to achieve instead was the construction of new forms of community within which the moral life could be sustained, so that both morality and civility might survive the coming ages of barbarism and darkness. If my account of our moral condition is correct, we ought also to conclude that for some time now, we too have reached that turning point. This time, however, the barbarians are not waiting beyond the frontiers. They have already been governing us for quite some time." Might be a good point to consider that studies have shown, it's printed in Forbes magazine just a few years ago, that around 21% of the CEOs of large businesses, around 25% of them are psychopaths. Yeah. This time, however, the barbarians are not waiting beyond the frontiers. They've already been governing us for quite some time, and it is our lack of consciousness of this that constitutes part of our predicament. We are waiting for another, doubtless quite different, Saint Benedict. So it was Saint Benedict who started the building the monasteries that ended up saving civilization as the Roman Imperium collapsed around the ears of the people of the Roman Empire. And then it was the monastics who trained the minds and the souls of the Europeans and brought them to the wonderful condition of the wide ownership of productive property that they had at the end of the Middle Ages. So what can we do? We have to form, like Alasdair MacIntyre said, we need new forms of community within which our moral life can be sustained. There is no division between our moral life and our economic life. Our economic decisions are moral decisions because the economy is made for man, not man for the economy. The economy is a result of human actions, human decisions, and all human decisions have a moral component in them. So we have got to work hard at building something new, but we have to understand the principles that will help that thing to be a truly moral economy, and not the kind of economy that we have now, where some workers can be exploited so horribly just to line the pockets of some millionaire with more millions of dollars. Okay, so when I come back, I'm going to go over some of the recommendations that are found within some of the church writings about the economy, or how we could possibly do that. Until we're together again, treat yourself as though you are someone you are responsible for helping, because you are responsible. So am I, and together we are making the world. Bye for now. Thanks so much for watching.